is Professor of Anthropology Christoph Lindner. He received his PhD from SUNY Albany and has taught at Bard since 1988. He's former president of New York Archaeological Council, as well as former president of Hudson River Heritage, the historic preservation group for advocacy and education. He's the author of scientific articles in journals such as Archaeology of Eastern North America, Northeast Anthropology, and Hudson Valley Regional Review. Lindner specializes in historical, geoarchaeological, landscape investigations and experimental use-where analysis of ancient tools. He maintains ongoing projects at the prehistoric forest at Bard and is the 18th and 19th century parsonage in Germantown. As scientific consultant, he participates in environmental impact studies and planning for protection of cultural resources in the Mid-Hudson Valley. So here to tell us more about all of his good findings is Professor Lindner.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks. Yeah. Just going to go watch the chords. Okay. Okay, are we ready? Yes, good. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Judy, for having me. This is really an amazing place to be and a very important...
Can't hear you.
Thank you. It's a very important weekend to be doing this as well. So where the timing here is converging in many ways. Is this a microphone that I have clipped to me?
It's for recording.
Oh, it's to record. Okay. Hello, recorder and people at home in the future. So I'm going to talk about plant remains that were used as food and medicine in ancestral indigenous sites in the Hudson Valley and its watershed and a few other places. But I wanted to start with this map because of the historic archaeological landscape mention that you heard in my background. So looking at the Hudson River, the Catskills, the tributaries here, the numbers indicate some of the archaeological places that I'll be talking about where indigenous things have been found. And I will use another map when we go farther afield, but I wanted to start you with this one here. And you know, I don't have a pointer except for this little mouse type thing. So let me see if I can, we're here, somewhere in here right now. Okay, so I am going to talk about, I think, 9 or 10 different places where plant remains have been found by archaeologists, and I'm going to try to work toward an interpretation of what this could mean, why we would be looking for these things, with some attention to the last couple thousand years. But I would take you first back 13,000 years to the very first, as far as we know, people in our area. Here's the Hudson Valley here, and at the Delaware Water Gap down here, at a place called Shawnee, Minnesink, a deposit along the stream there found remains of raspberries and wild spinach seeds, which is similar to what we call quinoa now from South America. It's a different species, but the same idea, hello, of these very nutritious seeds were found at Shawnee Minnesink site. So it goes back 13,000 years. People have been able to to find remains of food and medicine. And so that just places you down here at the water gap along the Delaware River. Okay, so back to our area. And the reason I chose this theme for the topic Judy invited me was because I have begun to work quite intensively on the plant remains that have been recovered over several decades of my work here through Bard College. And so I'm going to take you to some of those places, mostly in words. I have just these two maps. I kind of challenged myself to see whether, as an archaeologist, I could actually do a presentation without lots of photographs and lots of charts and things like that. But what I want to say is at Bard College, which is in this case here, in this area, right in this area, this is the Tivoli Bay, and just above it is the site that I've been working on quite intensively for the last couple of years. And that's why I have come back to working on plant remains. And that is a site that is going to become a performing arts laboratory. And I found the site in 1999, and 2 years ago I began to excavate it because it had to be destroyed for this new building that was designed by Maya Lin, a world-famous architect. The Stockbridge-Munsee Nation has been working with me to support the work. You might want to move or go down so the folks behind you can see. There's a chair there too, but please. So the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Stockbridge-Munsee, or the Mohican community, has visited a couple times. He did similar work on the Connecticut River. These are places where only a few centuries ago indigenous people lived, before folks from the Old World arrived. And he found an amazing deposit near Hartford on the Connecticut of maize, corn, and some other plants as well. So he recognized what we were seeing in the digging that we were doing, where we saw what looked like charred fibrous material, and which we think are burned plant remains. We don't know yet what it is. We've just begun to analyze it with a specialist who luckily lives in the area, and my students have been working with him. The tribal herbalist has also been to the site. Misty Cook is her name, and I'm delighted to say that her daughter is now a first-year student at Bard, who has helped her with her presentations on Mohican herbalism. So what we were able to do was to find 7 fire pits that we think are, at least the one we can identify, is about 500 years old. And so we are going through, we're dissolving the earth from these fire pits and then looking for the charred nuts, seeds, and sometimes the tissue of the plants. And I've been able to get a specialist to help us because this is beyond my knowledge. As you heard, I work mostly with chipstone tools, which we also found. So that's how we determine the age of a site, by the style of knives or piercing tools, as arrowheads in this case, or spearheads. So that is ongoing, and by next spring we should have some results of what people were cooking there in those fireplaces. So that's called the Manor Field site, if you're curious as to following this in the future. Excuse me. The next site to take you to is along the Esopus Creek, which is why I did this map for Mary McNamara, who's in the back row here, who wanted to use it to bring out the indigenous importance of the lower Esopus Creek. So that's why this map focuses there and not up and down the Hudson. But way up here along the headwaters of the Esopus Creek, there was a cliff overhang next to the Ashokan Field Campus, now called the Ashokan Center, I believe. And a person who was director of that knew what a fishing weight looked like. It's a little notched pebble. And so he asked me to come up, and we were sponsored by the Ashokan. The report is in the Ashokan Catskills book by Jack Bierhorst. And there was also a scientific article that came out of it. But when we excavated in the center of this, under the cliff overhang, we found a fireplace that we could say was right in the transition from simply indigenous people here to also people who brought brass and had smoking pipes made out of white clay. So it was a site that was probably around 1675, 1725, somewhere in that transitional period. And I had a paleo-ethnobotanist analyze the bits of charred plant material that were in the fireplace, and he found nuts. Charred nuts, walnuts, and hickory nuts. Okay? You're going to hear that over and over again as I present this. Almost all of the sites have those. He also found some fish, and he found some bones that had been smashed to smithereens to extract all the nutrition possible to get out of the bones. The faunal analyst, the person who did the bones at the New York State Museum, said we had hash that had just been pulverized, and a few pieces of deer could be identified, and some fish. So that's called the Little Falls Rock Shelter, and again, it's in Jack Bierhorst's book on the Ashokan Catskills. So the next site to take you to, come down the Esopus to the floodplain here. And in this area, I'd like to acknowledge Joseph Diamond, who is the archaeologist at SUNY New Paltz, who excavated with the avocational archaeologists, the people who do this out of the interest and goodness of their heart, who back in the late 1980s worked at a place called Wolfersteig. Before it had already been bulldozed, the topsoil had been removed, but they found pits. And in the pits, they were able to find corn, hickory nuts again, the wild spinach seeds like quinoa, but they also found cattail tissue, the stems of cattails, and wild onions. So these are not seeds or nuts, hard material. This is soft stuff. So to do the work that I'm doing for the college at Manor Field, I've hired the same specialist who knows how to identify those, what's usually not even seen in a sample under the microscope, little bits of tissue. And he has been able to figure out what they are as well. So that's Wolfersteig. And I think my next site here is at Goldcrest, which is across the river from downtown Albany. So it's up. Here's the Mohawk coming in. Goldcrest is right there. So that was going to become something related to oil transport. So archaeologists came in, discovered 2 longhouses, the post moles of longhouses, so they could actually show them. They were lined up, and on the south side was a pit with burned plant material in it. And the ethnobotanist there was Tonya Largi, and I introduced this because of how spectacular her find was. Amidst the pieces of corn were pieces of buttercup seeds. Buttercup seeds. Ranunculus is the genus of the. They're poisonous. So they used, yeah, people do. But they, according to the herbalist for the Mohegan indigenous people in eastern Connecticut, Gladys Tantagwidgen was her name. She said these were to counteract medicine, that is, malevolence, from the people settling across the river, the Dutch and the English. So they are medicine even though they are poisonous. They're to counteract the malevolence, I would say, of those people settling across. They also found lots of corn and some sturgeon as well. So that's the Gold Crest site. And you can see a really beautiful presentation in it about it in a book by Lynn Tentillo, who did very beautiful paintings of historical reconstructions. So that's Gold Crest. And now we're moving on to the college campus again. Oh, excuse me, I skipped one. Right here, near the Mohawk River on the Schoharie Creek. So the announcement calls it the Toa-Skohar, which is Mohawk for Floodwood Creek or river, which that creek does. People used to cross on bridges of all the dammed up wood in the spring. So they gave it that name, and we've changed it to Schoharie. But that's where I finished up my doctoral work at Albany, and I found a site that is about 2,000 years, maybe another 100 years in the past, which is a very, very poorly known period. Well, I call it the Great Gap. Between 2,500 and 1,600 years ago, there are very few sites in eastern New York and adjacent parts of the neighboring states. We don't know why. Before, there are lots of sites, hundreds of sites, that we can recognize, and afterwards. But there's a period of almost 1,000 years where we really don't know what's going on. And why that's interesting to me is because I grew up in Southwest Ohio, which is one of the centers of civilization of indigenous people around 2,000 years ago, plus or minus a few hundred years. What we call the mound builders, and technically they're called Adina or Hopewell. I like to call them the earth workers because they made giant earthworks, mounds that were 20 feet high and in some cases covered 4 square miles east of Columbus, Ohio. So they're from Columbus down to Cincinnati and along the Ohio River. So really they are the pinnacle of ceremonialism and art in the northeast of Turtle Island, North America. So I've always hoped that we would be able to find a connection because we know they were traveling from South Ohio to Yellowstone to get obsidian, to the Gulf Coast to get shells, even conch shells, to Ontario to get copper, to work into these beautiful pieces of sculpture, for the most part, that they would deposit in these ceremonial sites. So the mystery is, what could they have done here in the Hudson Valley? What would they get on a pilgrimage to the Hudson Valley? Why would they pick this place to contact the beings that they were seeking and bring back the materials? Or that people from here, the Hudson Valley, went to southern Ohio to participate in these ceremonies at these earthworks. The one specifically that we think was used for pilgrimage is, again, east of Columbus. It was the place where we can tell that they had figured out 2,000 some years ago where the moon rises the farthest north on the horizon every 18.6 years. No one else in the world knew this, as far as we know at this time. But it was important enough that they oriented a circle with an observatory mound and an octagon so that they could then celebrate the rising of the moon there and their knowledge of astronomy, geometry, surveying, as well as the working of these beautiful raw materials. So the notion has come out in the last, say, 20 years or so that this is about pilgrimage. It's not about trade, exchange of goods, and some other things. And there's still some other theories out there. But the possibility that people came here is suggested by a certain kind of chipped piece of stone that is like a razor blade. It's called a bladelet. It's a little thinner than a razor blade and a little longer. They are difficult to make. They were only made during this period in southern Ohio when there are hundreds of them, sometimes even thousands of them, and in southern Illinois River Valley. We have them here in the Hudson Valley. We found one at the college a few years ago. We also dated that site. I'm getting ahead of myself here. But the Lopuk site, that's named after the farmer on the Schoharie, got me started on this. Because there were also, in addition to these bladelets, there were what we call micro drills, 2 or 3 millimeters in diameter, that we think were used to drill shell beads for ceremonial purposes, based on what they look like in Illinois. And so we did an intensive analysis. One of my students wrote her thesis on this, and we worked together to publish it, even though it turned out we had a different signature in the microscope that it was actually hardwood or antler. So it didn't match. We couldn't prove it, but we were looking for a connection between where people lived, what we call a habitation site, and where they were buried, which would be a mortuary site. At that time, mostly all we knew were about where people were buried from excavations decades ago, not current excavations. Very similar to the situation in Ohio, where it took years and years before someone could find out where the people who made the earthworks actually lived and what their daily life was like, and how all this ceremonialism might have fit into this. So that got me going when I came to New York for graduate school from Southwest Ohio, and then has continued ever since through my work at the college. We also excavated at Lighthouse Cove, overlooking the Hudson at Saugerties, and again we found nuts, and we found turtle shells that may have been consumed, and it was another place where we could see the presence of these people when, for the most part, there was very little. I think there are a total of 7 sites, as opposed to hundreds before and after in the Hudson Valley for that nearly 1,000-year period. So Lighthouse Cove also had some acorn, first time I'm bringing that in, and then we go back to the college to Grouse Bluff. So let me take us back there. That site here at Bard is just overlooking this little peninsula. It's tiny on there, but it drops directly down into the Hudson. And there we found in a pit, which looks like it was an earth oven. It's full of ash. It's about this deep. I mean, it's about this big and that deep. Full of ash, but very little burned rock and no signs of burning. So we think it was actually an oven. There's a fireplace, remnants of a fireplace next to it, burning and burned rock. We think that those rocks were just raked in, it heated up, they put things in, and then they covered it over and baked. What, we were wondering, about 2,000 years ago. And so our analysis of that, again, Tanya Largy, who did Goldcrest, and she's at the Harvard Peabody Museum. So she's the specialist that we've been using, although she's about to retire. She found arrowwood. So Viburnum dentata, an ornamental plant for us these days, but suitable for making arrow shafts or spear shafts at that time. We also found in the other pits at Grouse Bluff, overlooking the Hudson, lots of hickory nuts, some acorn, and the tiny seeds of huckleberries. And these are pits that are about 900 to 1,000 years, so more recently. Okay, so you've been hearing about, at the beginning, about 500 years old, then 2,000 years old when people from Ohio might have come here, or people from here went there, or both, to the time in between. So part of what we're working on here is to be able to create a continuum where we can trace the ancestral places back in time. And at this point, scientifically, we can only get back maybe 1,100 years from now, so 600 years into the past. And usually that's based on pottery. sometimes on chipped stone, like spear points and knives. What I'm hoping we'll be able to do is with plants. So in Ohio, the reason, perhaps, or part of the reason for this fluorescence of civilization in southern Ohio is that their horticultural activities are really taking off. They have very little corn, maybe some just being used for ceremonies, but they have other plants that were wild that they have domesticated. The seeds are larger, particularly the wild spinach seeds. It's this genus Pinopodium. So this cultivation, they've gradually selected for plants that are more nutritious and easier to access in their processing of the plants, cooking and so forth. If we were able to find that, we might get a whole other reason why the people here in the Hudson Valley and elsewhere, all across eastern North America, were receptive to the people from Ohio. We're still trying to learn on why they got along so well, because it's a time when there is very little sign of violence for hundreds of years. But usually we can tell the signs either in artwork or in the burials, and there's almost none. It seems to be a long piece of people who were able to travel and get along with each other. And that is in itself a question. We have a feeling it's what they carried with them, possibly the copper, because the copper was being made into musical instruments, into panpipes. So the sight of the flash of copper and the sounds that it made that might imitate birds, but with a human feeling to it, might have been what enabled people from here to go there and vice versa. So, and then what did they carry? Why were they so well received? Well, it could be the seeds they were carrying. It could be the sunflower is the one we know best, the domesticated quinoa-like plant, or wild spinach. And I think I'm to the last site that I want to tell you about, and that's called Forest Site. Judy mentioned it. It was found when Bard built a new baseball field. And when we recognized that there were enough chipped stone to suggest that there was people there for some time, we were able to move the baseball field on paper 50 feet in one direction, move it 200 feet in another direction, and then the college could proceed. But since then, since 2012, we've been working on the forest site, sometimes called the Enchanted Forest, because the Bard students' nickname for it. It's near the art buildings, and there are certain kinds of exotic plants that grow like wisteria up in the trees. The five-leafed akebia, which is also called the chocolate plant because of the fragrance of its flowers. So there are various reasons why, and it's near the art building at Bard. So there have been sculptures that come and go. So it's become enchanted in the students' imagination, and now this is the 14th year we've worked on the forest site to see what we could find. Yeah. Now we have a cockapoo meeting a Westie, it looks like. Okay. So that's my cockapoo. Bye, Owen. So what we found at the forest site was one of those small bladelets that I mentioned is like a token that represents the presence of Hopewellian people.
What's the stone?
The stone is made out of flint from the Coxsackie area. Yeah, it's greenish, and sort of part of it turns to a little reddish. It's very waxy. Everything else is sort of gray and brown, but then this one stands out. Yes?
How were the bladelets used?
Well,
I know that's a thing.
lots of things, yes. And my students are currently, just this week, working on research that's been published already where people have made them and used them on various things and then studied the results under the microscope and then compared that to the specimens. So there's two things going on. They're like any other sharp flint tools on some sites, But on other sites, smaller ones, they look like they are for ceremonialism, particularly the care of the dead. Because of what, this is where we can go with this. They're used mostly for cutting and scraping instead of all the other tasks you might do, drilling and as an arrowhead or a spear point on these other special sites. This is from the Illinois River near where interstate whatever goes to St. Louis. And so what they've seen is that it was probably for working leather or matting, which we know historically were important materials to use in burial ceremonies. They've not substantiated the notion that they were actually for processing the dead, but that's another theory that we don't see a lot of evidence for as yet. Yes?
You don't see any of those kinds of burials in this part?
No, we do not. The nearest ones would be near Rochester, south of Rochester in the Genesee Valley at Squawky Hill would be the name. And that was excavated in the 1950s by the Rochester Museum. There are a few there. Yes?
Any consistency or generalizations you can make from the 3 sites on the bar campus? Is that a stretch?
Well, yeah. Actually, you said 3, Henry, but I skipped one. Because I thought, well, that's not going to add too much. I skipped the second to last one on my list here. It's called Spice Bush. It's below the grouse bluff that I was talking about where the huckleberries were. So that's on a bluff overlooking the Hudson. Down below it, going right down into the Hudson, is a place called Spice Bush, after the main plant that grows there, Lindera benzoin. And we found in a pit there with very complicated decorated pottery, looking to be the same time period, say 1,500 years ago, there was chipstone that had to have come from Ohio. It's translucent, it's reddish, and it has, I mean, it's the size of your little fingernail, but it's distinctive. You can see light through it. It looks like in this reddish stone that there's a dark cloud, and then there's a streak of lightning, of quartz going through it. So in miniature, it's a whole landscape of an approaching storm. So that was in this pit, along with hickory nuts.
That's the consistency.
Yeah, they loved hickory, and walnut, and some acorns.
Hickory and oak too, because we're in a hickory oak forest.
You got it. Mm-hmm.
And it's right there. We see it all
Yep.
the time.
Yep.
Hickory oak.
Yep, you got it. And we oftentimes find the wood. So we can also not just medicine and food, but tell what they were using for fuel. And oftentimes it's hickory and walnut and oak. Right? You got it.
And the little creatures are very excited when they come out because they're gathering and opening right on the
Yeah,
path.
yeah.
They're opening the seeds, the little hard hickory. Not easy.
No, it isn't. It's quite hard. Yeah. Yes?
Are there any specific indications that tell you that those bladelets were being transitioned by way of people traveling rather than just trade routes?
Not as yet, but with them, remember, I just mentioned this translucent reddish with black and white. There are pieces that are grayish that look like they came from Ohio. We don't see them as bladelets, but they're chips, and we keep looking. Some of them are almost clear, but they're not crystal. They're flint of some kind. Yeah. And so when I went to Ohio, to the place where this was quarried, east of Columbus, near this pilgrimage site that I mentioned with the earthworks and the observatory of the moonrise. So that is very close to about a 7-mile ridge where this beautiful stone occurs that even when it's heated up, turns bright red. I mean, it's just spectacular, and it's translucent. So the boulders there, because this is the bedrock of Flint Ridge, Ohio, the boulders, the weathered part, are a kind of a gray, translucent gray, and that looks like what we might be finding at the forest site. And we've got maybe a dozen of those, just chips right now.
So is it an igneous rock or a sedimentary?
It's a sedimentary rock. Yeah. It's found usually in shale sometimes some sandstone.
So how does it differ from the chert that we find in the limestone here? It's black. Or is it obsidian found in the
No.
west?
Now, the city is all coming, as far as I know, from the far west, from, say, Yellowstone in particular. Right. Yeah. Geologically, it's chert. It means it's impure silicon dioxide. So it's basically glass with some impurities. And the flint technically the flint that we find actually comes from France or England and was brought over either as ballast or as gunflints.
Yeah.
And we do find some. But we're really talking technically about chert, C-H-E-R-T. Yeah. And though we have some very beautiful chert here, such as at Flint Mine Hill near Coxsackie, or West Athens Hill, which is the New York State Museum excavated. It's very lustrous, it's very multicolor. It doesn't have all the characteristics of the, technically Vanport is the geologic name of Flint Ridge. It's a spectacular material. And it contains quartz crystals as well in the raw material. Yes?
Do we have any sites with bears? Obviously, ritual, a dead bear with beads around its neck. And supposedly there's a 7th century BC, somewhere in the Middle East, that has this ritual of a bear.
Anatolia.
Anatolia, right, it's in Anatolia.
Yeah. We don't, in our immediate area, have evidence of bear ceremonialism. You get out in central New York, so that would be Haudenosaunee territory, the Iroquoian people. Yeah. There is a site excavated again in the 1950s where there were parts of bear along the Seneca River and lots of pottery vessels that looked like they were being offered into the river in celebration of the bear. And so there has been a fair amount of interpretation about bear ceremonialism getting down into the Northeast from the Arctic, but getting there from the Siberia. And really, it's a circumpolar phenomenon of bear ceremonialism is what it's called, yeah. But not in this immediate area, as far as I know. Yeah, it may be found as yet. There's still many, many places to look. Yeah. Yes, again.
How, well, is it possible to link the peoples that are being, that you're researching by excavating these sites and the people like the Asokas that appear in the documentary record later in the 17th century? Like, do we know that these are the same, that these are the ancestors of those people? Do we know that they're not, for instance?
Yeah, we pretty much know.
Cool.
Yeah, so Goldcrest is kind of that transition site. Also, possibly Little Falls Rock Shelter that I mentioned second. And that's why I started there at this transitional time where people are. There's evidence. So at Goldcrest, there are bits of kettles that are in that same pit. Just little scraps of brass that had to have been gotten from across the river at Fort Orange, or later Albany. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, well.
No other signs of fish. You mentioned sturgeon, but there's no other evidence of fish.
Yes, there is. Okay. So, sturgeon is one that we've focused on. And we have an exhibit. If you want to know more about archaeology that I've done with my students, there's a website, just Googling Bard Archaeology with the old spelling Aeology. And there's a panel at the college on the Greenway Trail. It's 16 feet long, which is just a little bit bigger than the largest sturgeon, funded by the Hudson River Foundation, which has a particular interest in that very ancient fish. So we find bits of sturgeon. That last site that I mentioned, I kind of gave it a rest and then I threw it in response to the question about the spice bush site, also had sturgeon. And it's in that exhibit. You can see it magnified because we found a tiny piece of it. So it has a fair occurrence. On the smaller island in Tivoli Bay, let's see if it's on here. Yeah, it's right here. So this is Kruger Island, and this is Magdalene Island, or Goat Island. In the rock shelter there, where there was a human burial, but also lots of habitation debris, I think 4 or 5 different fish were found. And at Grouse Bluff, the one just above there, we found fish scales of I think it was a perch, maybe. Right now, it's not quite a perch. Anyway, the analyst who worked with Tanya at the Peabody said, the funny thing about this is nobody would have eaten this fish, but other fish would. So clearly it was inside the fish that they were cooking on this giant fireplace, which we think was probably sturgeon, because it's found in the site down below it at Spicebush. Yes?
Did you talk with Joe Diamond about the archaeology that was done here in this building?
Yes, I have.
You had, because
Yeah.
they discovered, I'm the architect that was in charge of the job.
Yes, indeed.
And we found, I don't know, many thousands of extinct animals and all kinds of things. But the contact period was about 2.5 feet down, I think, from the street line outside.
Yeah.
But what he found below that, I can't remember at the moment. But did he do seeds? I don't know, seeds and...
Well, the Wolfersteig site that I mentioned is Joe's site, working with a faunal analyst, Amorosi, and then David Perry, who I'm working with now, which is partly why I chose him to work with. Plus, Tanya's retiring. And the previous guy who I worked with at Little Falls Rock Shelter retired long ago, is now just editing archaeology reports. That's Roger Moeller. So there aren't many of these people around. It means endless hours on a microscope to find these tiny pieces. So yes.
Is there any connection with the heart? Because as a poet, I've found a lot of connection with heart and language. And I just wonder if this is unique to certain places only, or if the heart is a place that is considered a special, what did we say, you and I, about the heart? The heart is...
Well, it's just a heart organ of spiritual perception.
Mm-hmm.
But the heart is the organ
That's a good question, yeah.
of spiritual perception. We're always concerned with doing, and then being, of course, is the love part, and that thing is beginning to get a little more interest now. I know my teacher at NYU gave me a book that introduced me to Buddhism, and it was because he thought I was the only one in the class who could understand the poetic nuance of the heart. And it happened to be true, by the way.
Yeah.
And I do care about that.
I would hope, yeah. I can't say that I think of any archaeologically. I think hearts are, there are designs of hearts on moccasins, beaded moccasins, if I'm not mistaken. So that might be a lead for you. Yeah, but archaeologically...
In the movie Last of the Mohicans,
Yeah.
the Mohawks attacked the British, and one of the leaders of the Mohawks killed the general and took out his heart and ate it.
Whoa.
There you go.
Right on the spot.
Yeah, okay.
So that was traditionally, I think,
Is that in the book, or did Hollywood add that? I can't remember. But yeah, there was ritual cannibalism in warfare in historic times, particularly among the Iroquoian groups.
Yeah.
So the Mohawks are a member of that group. Yes, Mary?
I wondered if there was anything you wanted to share with us that you took from your research in the area about the Esopus Valley or our site here at the Pearson House. If there's some sweeping something.
Yeah, I can't. I honestly, I think this place is terrific, but I can't really speak to what was found here. But the valley, yeah. There's a site that I didn't include in my presentation because of partly who I was trying to introduce. So the Hurley site that we've talked about, which was excavated over many, many years by a person who lived just down the road from Hurley. And it was one of my students organized the materials at the State Museum as her internship. And then just a few years ago, they overturned a long-standing understanding that people in this area were not heavily invested in corn agriculture, maize agriculture. And now it looks like they were, based on that one particular site, the Hurley site. Yeah, there are hundreds of pits there full of bird corn and other plant materials.
What did you say the plant's name was?
Maize,
Maize.
M-A-I-Z-E, which is to distinguish other meanings of the word corn sometimes. Yeah, Zia maize. Yes, Judy.
What do you think about, I think it was Robert Jewett's account of when Henry Hudson came up the Hudson, that the sturgeon were so thick that you could walk on them? I believe that's what was in his diary.
Yeah, I think it's the alewives that they were walking on, supposedly. The sturgeon are at the bottom, usually.
Okay.
They're bottom feeders. But, yeah, I think that the fish were very abundant at that time, and the sturgeon was almost fished to extinction around 1900. Partly habitat change, but partly over-exploitation. It's coming back. It's endangered in the Hudson. In the exhibit that I mentioned to you, which you can see on the Greenway Trail, but you can also find on the BARD website, although it's been down recently, it talks about, let's see, where did I want to go with this? The sturgeon, I'm sorry, I've suddenly lost track of your question.
How thick, how many fish?
Oh, yeah,
were
the
there?
fish, right. So you'll see sturgeon all along the Hudson. So it has a map of all the occurrences of the sturgeon that have been found. And it has about the extinction. At one time, Hyde Park was known as the caviar capital of the world because of the concentration of Atlantic sturgeon between there and Columbia County, Greene County. So it was really the focus of the fishing. And it does get up at the tributaries, such as the Sopus a little ways and other tributaries, if it gets past the waterfalls. Yeah. So I think Joe found it at Wolfersteig, in fact. So it must have been brought inland several miles to get to that site. Yes?
Do you think they were, like, people might have been traveling to fish at those spots too? Because I know Joe's also found them kind of far afield from her. Like, he's found them at
Certainly. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we really have got to understand how much people traveled. Yeah, on foot, by canoe. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they were in touch with other people who lived in those other places. So the long distance, short distance, but really long distance. I mean, from Hudson Valley to the Newark Earthworks near Columbus is 700 miles. Yeah, so it would have taken a month or so by canoe and portage and so forth. But very possibly they did it. We know they were coming from as far away as Alabama, based on the pottery, what's in the pottery that you can, identify the minerals. Yeah, so they are traveling long distances to Ohio, but also from Ohio to get those raw materials. Yeah, and where I was going with the exhibit that I mentioned is that one of the BARD students did her BARD thesis and then her master's thesis at BARD on a site where sturgeon is really focused north of Catskill called Tufano. And there were sturgeon remains in pits sort of intermingled with human remains and deer remains. And Audrey Reifler, who did that study, had the tools made at Vassar by Lucy Johnson, and then she had people who normally butcher sturgeon and deer, an indigenous person who hunted deer a lot, and then she studied the wear on the edges of the tools under the microscope and compared it to the specimen. So we could see they were using those tools, which are the size of your hand, made out of flint, on both of those animals.